surgical scenes. On Dispatches tonight, one of Britain's commonest operations, given a full and thorough examination. 100,000 women have this surgery every year, but how much of it is really necessary? Tonight, reporter Juliette Foster investigates one of the biggest decisions a woman can take, the removal of her womb. But tonight's Dispatch reveals that hysterectomy is a lottery, with women in some parts of the country 4 times more likely to undergo the operation than in others. Tonight, the women who believe they have been robbed, who have lost their wombs or ovaries, some without proper discussion, others without their consent. Has medicine really got the balance right? That's Dispatches on the winners and losers in Operation Lottery.
My name's Erica. I'm Mrs. Caroline.
Hi.
Okay, I'll just show you to your room, Mrs. Christie.
Fine.
52-year-old Catherine Christie is going into hospital for a major operation. There's nothing seriously wrong with her, and the operation is potentially dangerous. But it's a chance she's willing to take. For the last 3 years, her life has been made a misery by her heavy periods. She's decided that her best hope is a hysterectomy.
It just got worse over the past month or 2, and I just thought, well, I'm going to have to give in and have this done.
Every year across Britain, 100,000 women are doing the same thing. Some doctors think that many of these hysterectomy operations are unnecessary.
Hysterectomy is the only surgery that I can think of where completely normal organs are taken out routinely.
And at the same time, women often lose their ovaries during hysterectomy, sometimes without their consent.
It's like me walking up to a random woman in the street and taking her breasts off, her ovaries off, or somebody walking up to a random man in the street and taking their balls off.
The National Health Service spends £200 million a year on hysterectomy, even though doctors can't agree on when they should use the operation.
Whether or not you'll have a hysterectomy is a bit of a lottery. It depends entirely who you go to see and what their particular practice styles are like.
Every lottery has its winners and losers. For some women, hysterectomy brings freedom from heavy and painful periods. For others, it brings bitterness, regret, and years of suffering. 49-year-old Vivian Box is one of the losers. 22 years ago, she was admitted to hospital with a suspected ovarian cyst. It was supposed to be a straightforward operation, but it ruined her life.
Monday was my 27th birthday, so I'll always remember it. And I went into the hospital on Sunday evening, was prepared for the operation, went down for the operation on the Monday, and the first I really knew about it was the following Wednesday, the Wednesday after the operation, and I was told I'd had a hysterectomy.
Without her permission, the gynecologist had removed Mrs. Box's womb and taken out her ovaries at the same time.
He made it sound like he was God and he just saved my life. He said because, well, he actually said that in 6 months' time they couldn't have been able to say what would have happened. And I don't know whether I was a bit naive at the time, but I just felt that, you know, I was grateful, I suppose, to him, because he made it sound like he'd saved my life.
Vivian Box made a quick physical recovery.
but it took longer for the mental scars to heal.
It suddenly began to dawn on me I'd never be a mother. And that was very hurtful. It was a shock. So I wasn't only coping with the fact that I'd had major surgery, I was also coping with the grief that I would never be able to have children.
But along with the grief, there's anger. Vivian Box had symptoms of a disease of the womb called endometriosis. It's often treatable with drugs. Her life was never in danger.
You see, 22 years ago, you didn't sort of question the medical profession. You just assumed that what they did, they knew what they were doing. And therefore you put your life in their hands. And it appears now sometimes, in some cases, that isn't always the thing. So
Catherine Christie has every reason to trust her gynecologist. They've discussed the risks and benefits of hysterectomy. And the operation was only chosen after drug treatments had failed.
We tried the other options, we'd looked at the medical treatments available, and she had decided herself that her periods were so interfering with her work that this was the option she preferred. My role is to preserve fertility and preserve function. So I don't think that hysterectomy, in the absence necessarily of malignant disease or a specific medical indication of hysterectomy, should be necessarily the first option.
But most surgeons are much more enthusiastic about hysterectomy. John Studd is one of Britain's leading gynecologists. He believes that for some women, hysterectomy is inevitable.
It's a very old-fashioned concept that you let a woman suffer for 5 or 6 years until she's anemic and in a lot of pain before you at last get round to a hysterectomy. That, I think, is unkind. I'm always amazed at how willingly women go to have this major operation. I'm amazed how willingly they have a hysterectomy, and no doubt it's because they have had months and years of awful periods.
But unlike other branches of medicine, doctors rarely test hysterectomy patients before the operation.
It does strike me as peculiar that hysterectomy is the only surgery that I can think of where completely normal organs are taken out routinely. If you have anything else wrong with you, you go through a rigorous, objective set of tests to prove there's an abnormality before you have your gallbladder out or before you have a torn cartilage in your knee out. If you have chest pain, you're referred for a treadmill exercise. And yet, every day in this country, women with perfectly normal wombs are having major surgery with the risks of death under the anaesthetic, etc., for a completely normal aspect of our lives.
But the use of hysterectomy is increasing. To discover just how many of these operations might be unnecessary, Dispatches commissioned a nationwide survey comparing hysterectomy rates across the country. The results are astonishing. Within some health districts, gynecologists are up to 4 times more likely to perform the operation as elsewhere. Wigan tops the league. The lowest rate of hysterectomies is in the Kensington, Chelsea and Westminster district. In Scotland, doctors in the Borders are twice as likely to take out a woman's womb as in the Shetlands.
We know there are big variations in hysterectomy rates, and we know that one of the likely causes of that is that in the high rate areas, the gynecologists there prefer to do operations, whereas in the low rate areas, which can be where the hysterectomy rate may be half as or less, the rate in the high area, then those gynecologists are likely to be more conservative. But we do also actually know that GPs' decisions are very important in this, and that if referral rates vary, then GPs differ in whether they think an operation is necessary.
Yes. There's an answer machine.
Sally Hope is one GP who wants to save her patients from hysterectomy whenever possible. She knows that most gynecologists want to operate.
Gynecology is a surgical specialty, and so gynecologists are trained surgeons, and therefore I think they feel that general practitioners have tried all the medical options, and if we refer somebody to a gynecologist, it is really committing them to surgery. It's really the onus on the GP to give a full discussion of the pros and cons of all the different treatments, medical and surgical. Once you refer a woman to a gynecologist, they're often swept down the whitewater rapids towards a hysterectomy, possibly without really even wanting one, but they get onto the conveyor belt of hospital specialties and surgery.
Josie Connolly was caught on the conveyor belt with disastrous results. 2 years ago, when her GP was away, another doctor referred her to a gynecologist because she had non-cancerous growths called fibroids in her womb. Her only symptom was heavy periods. The gynecologist didn't offer her the option of removing them surgically or shrinking them with drugs. At 36, Mrs. Connolly was advised to have a hysterectomy.
You know, even before the operation, I had nightmares. I had a lot of nightmares about it. And I used to wake up crying several nights before the operation. And, you know, I really am a very, very strong person. I'm very motivated, assertive. I just find it very hard. I keep asking myself, why did I go ahead? Why did I continue?
With the operation just 4 weeks away, Mrs. Connolly felt pressured. She had little time to consider the implications. She was desperate.
When I went back to my GP and explained to her what had happened, I mean, she was very, very helpful to me. And she said, you know, you should perhaps ask for a scan, find out. She said, do you know how big the fibroids are or how many you've got? And I said, I have no idea. And she said, well, suggest, you know, you find out and ask for a scan.
With the operation getting closer, Josie Connolly tried to talk to her gynecologist. After much persistence, she eventually managed to find him, but his reaction was dismissive.
And I requested a scan, and he said, it's Mrs. Connolly, a scan will tell us nothing more than we already know. That was his answer. So that's what I was left with. I just believed it, you know. But in hindsight, I wish I had been given a scan. You know, I would really like to know, because now I live with the regret perhaps it wasn't necessary. You know, because there was no test done at all.
3/4 of all hysterectomies are performed for heavy periods, but nobody actually knows what a heavy period is.
I don't know whether my periods are heavy or not, and I don't know how yours are. We just talk about it, but we don't sit in the lavatory comparing tampons. And so the real problem is we have no objective measurement of heavy periods.
I mean, if you've got a cancer, then what you rely on is a doctor knowing how to cure that cancer. And that is a very precise and complicated biological process about which there is an awful lot of information, and it's all basically scientific. And the assumption is that that person doesn't want that cancer, so let's get rid of it, and that's essentially the end of the treatment decision-making process. With hysterectomy, what you've essentially got is a woman who has, in her perception, it must be emphasized, heavy periods. She may not have heavy periods when measured accurately, but in her perception, she has heavy periods. And there we enter the debate. How do you apply a biological solution, namely surgery, to essentially a problem of a woman's individual perceptions?
We know that about half of the women who are referred for hysterectomy for heavy bleeding actually don't have heavy bleeding at all. Studies have shown that. So they probably don't need surgery.
18 hours to go. Catherine Christie is convinced she does need a hysterectomy, and her consultant agrees. Catherine knows exactly what she's in for.
So the plan tomorrow is that we will take the womb out, okay, and in view of your age, we will also take the ovaries out, okay. I mean, if you'd been, 5 years earlier, I would have left them in. So, all being well, if everything's okay, you'd be fit to go home again on Friday. Fine. Okay?
Fine.
Okay, we're off out.
Okay, thank you.
We'll see you in the morning.
Yeah.
Okay.
Bye.
It's a big decision, but Catherine is well prepared. But in Britain today, too many women are still losing their wombs without their consent. Frances Henton is one of them. 3 years ago, she agreed to the removal of an ovarian cyst, but then she made a horrific discovery.
Nurse came by and I said, look, I'm suffering terribly here. Is there anything you can give me? And she said, we can get you some peppermint oil, Mrs. Henton. And I said, well, is this normal? Does everybody get this after an operation? And she said, oh yes, it's quite normal in hysterectomy patients. And I said, but I haven't had a hysterectomy. I've just had a cyst removed. And that sort of schoolmarmy voice they use in hospitals. Oh no dear, she said, oh no, you've had a hysterectomy.
The gynecologist said he thought Mrs. Henton had cancer and he removed her reproductive organs to protect her. But after the operation, a biopsy on her womb, cervix and ovaries revealed they were healthy. The gynecologist says he discussed his suspicions with Mrs. Henton before surgery. She has no recollection of this. Mrs. Henton sued her gynecologist, and although he denied liability, his insurance company paid her substantial compensation.
I don't think any woman who's going in for surgery is going to forget what the consultants told her. She's not going to forget that he said that she might have cancer. Her husband isn't going to forget. Her family aren't going to forget. And let's face it, going through the sort of legal wrangle that I've gone through is no picnic. I wouldn't recommend it to anybody. It was a matter of principle. That should never have happened. I should have been told what was suspected before surgery was done.
Thousands of women could be saved from hysterectomy if they were told about alternative treatments.
If you provide a range of options, then because the range is wider than just surgery, it's most likely that some women will prefer to take the other options than the option of surgery.
At the Rosie Maternity Hospital in Cambridge, Professor Smith uses a fibre optic tube to examine his patient's uterus. He believes women should have a proper diagnosis before embarking on surgery so they can decide whether they will prefer other treatments to the knife.
There will be some gynecologists who too readily use the knife, but similarly there may be some patients who too readily wish to have a hysterectomy. And that's why the debate needs to be begun, and I think the awareness needs to be increased about this problem and to look at the options that are actually available.
But the Dispatches survey has found that across Britain there's a frighteningly low level of awareness of the problem. Wigan didn't think they had one. They told Dispatches,
if a hysterectomy is an appropriate clinical procedure, it would worry us if patients were not being offered one.
Wakefield hadn't even realised their rates were so high until they heard the Dispatches' evidence. East Kent knows there's a problem, but are trying to get their surgeons to tackle it.
Although it is difficult for health authorities to influence the work of consultants, we have asked our local gynecologists to audit their work.
Women across Britain are being given hysterectomies, even though gynecologists have little idea whether they're satisfied with the results. Professor Clym Macpherson has recently embarked on a study of 10,000 hysterectomy patients. The results could force a rethink on how the operation is used.
Consultants do the operation on selected women and they follow them up after maybe 6 or 8 weeks, and that's the last they see of them. So they don't know what happens to the general run of women having hysterectomy a year after the operation. General practitioners, in their turn, will see women who are having bad experience after a year or 6 months after 2 years, but they will not see women who are having a wonderful experience, who think the hysterectomy is just great. Because if you think a hysterectomy is just great, you don't complain to your GP. So therefore a proper assessment of what the likelihood of various complications or indeed benefits are relies on unselected follow-up of all women having the operation for a long time, which just never gets done, basically. And therefore the idea that people know what the long-term consequences of hysterectomy are is a little bit whistling in the wind.
Hopefully Catherine Christie will be lucky, unlike others whose lives have been ruined.
Every operation carries risks. In the case of hysterectomy, there are complication rates which are quite high. About nearly half of all women suffer some complication or other following the operation, which they have to recover from. Fortunately, most of these complications are relatively minor, but it'll take an average woman at least 2 months to get over the operation. So she's going to have to take time off work, it's going to disrupt her life.
Hysterectomies also compromise to some degree a woman's ovarian function. It's not entirely clear why. It does mean that the risk of heart disease and the risk of osteoporosis is probably increased a bit by having hysterectomy because of the effect it has on ovarian function.
The risk of death from a hysterectomy is immediate death due to the anaesthetic, which is about 1 in 10,000. There are also post-operative complications of possible clots in the legs, deep vein thrombosis going up into your lung, which is called pulmonary embolism. And women should understand these risks of serious mortality or morbidity before they undergo the surgery.
For Josie Connolly, the weeks following her hysterectomy turned into a nightmare. She felt awful immediately after the operation, and 3 weeks later had abdominal pain her gynecologist said was wind. But she was rushed to hospital when things got worse.
I was really, really upset, very, very upset. I was crying, I was in desperate pain. And my little one, who was 2 at the time, just sat in the back of the car watching me roll and cry in pain all the way to the hospital. She just kept looking at me very strangely.
Her condition deteriorated and she was moved to an intensive care wing. Mrs. Connolly had developed a blood clot which became infected, a common complication of hysterectomy. It led to peritonitis and septicemia. She thought she was going to die.
I remember thinking, you've got 3 children. You've got to put in a bit of fight here, and I just couldn't. I thought, well, no, they'll be okay. I had resigned myself to think, well, this is it, really. I was just a total broken person. I really was. I couldn't believe that somebody could be broken down to such a level.
Half of all hysterectomy patients are under 45, and many will have their ovaries removed at the same time. This can lead to heart disease or a thinning of the bones called osteoporosis. These long-term dangers can be alleviated by hormone replacement therapy, or HRT, which convinces many doctors it's right to remove ovaries even before the menopause.
I think there are a lot of good arguments for removing ovaries with consent, there's no question about that, and for discussion. Now, shall we say from the age of 45? I believe the evidence is overwhelming that you should advise removal of ovaries and efficient HRT, and they come together. One is not without the other.
Few doctors like to counter such enthusiasm for the removal of ovaries, but Catherine Christie has found one. She is only losing her ovaries because she's been through the menopause.
Oh, why are you taking the ovaries out of this lady?
Okay, well, how old is this lady?
52.
Okay, we'll come closer this one.
It needs a little bit of curl on it, doesn't it?
Yeah. Okay. Right. Do you think her ovaries are likely to be functioning?
No.
Okay, so what's the average age of the menopause?
About 50 years.
Yeah, so about 50.8 as it happens.
So if she's a younger lady, you'd leave her ovaries.
Very much so. Yes, I mean, I argue with my I was going to say male colleagues, but even some of my younger female colleagues start taking ovaries out at the age of 45. I feel very strongly that we shouldn't remove ovaries unless they're diseased, unless there's a very specific reason to do so. The problem with removing your ovaries is as soon as you take them out, you're instantly through the menopause. You then have with it the risk of osteoporosis or thinning of the bone. And there's increasing evidence that putting someone through a menopause, be it premature or an ordinary menopause, will in fact increase the risk of developing heart attack and stroke.
I'm concerned about the increasing tendency to remove ovaries because I worry that it's going to lead to an epidemic of osteoporosis. If a woman has her ovaries removed before the menopause, she needs to go on a course of hormone replacement therapy. Most gynecologists who take the ovaries out at the same time as hysterectomy will start the woman off on hormone replacement therapy. However, in order to reduce the risk of osteoporosis and cardiovascular disease, the woman ought to take HRT for a long period. At least 10 years probably. And what we know is that very few women actually do carry on taking HRT.
A range of surveys has shown that after 9 months, half of all women have abandoned HRT. Even for those who keep it up, there are still problems, as Susan McShane has found out. 3 years ago, she lost her ovaries. Now she takes HRT because of what happened to her mother after her ovaries were removed.
My mother had been a high-flying woman, very active, really vibrant, loved dancing. And I always remember that she said it was the worst day's work that had happened to her. She deteriorated very rapidly. My mother ended up with osteoporosis, osteoarthritis, rheumatoid arthritis, and polymyalgia. So it was a warning light to me.
Susan now suffers from chronic insomnia because of all the side effects of HRT. She's tried different doses, but one way or another, all of them make her ill. The dose she needs gives her bad mood swings and serious water retention.
So I've actually had to opt for half the dose, which worries me because now I feel I'm at risk of osteoporosis and heart disease, everything that they said that they were doing this operation to protect me from.
The main argument for taking out women's ovaries is that it prevents them from getting ovarian cancer.
4,500 women die every year of ovarian cancer. And the trouble with the disease is that it's silent. It's a silent killer that doesn't have any warning.
But osteoporosis is a much bigger killer.
When we're down by the cervix here at this point in time.
12,000 women die each year, more than twice the number for ovarian cancer.
And what is the risk of ovarian cancer?
About 2% of ladies.
Yes, but do you know what the risk of ovarian cancer is in women who had their ovaries?
Many doubt whether taking out a woman's ovaries as a purely preventative measure can possibly be justified.
If you take everybody's ovaries out now, everybody aged, I don't know what, 40. If you take everybody's ovaries out at age 40, what you will do is eliminate ovarian cancer, and therefore people will not die of ovarian cancer. As a consequence of that, all women will live on average for 4.5 days longer only, largely because most women will not get ovarian cancer anyway.
Such arguments haven't reduced the conventional enthusiasm for surgery, whatever one's sex.
If testicular cancer killed 4,500 men a year, and if male HRT was as well developed as female HRT, I would be first in the queue.
You would go first to have your testicles removed?
Yeah, I'm telling you that if there are 4,500 men who die every year of testicular cancer and HRT was effective, I'd be right there at the front.
Jackie?
Yeah.
Tracy, come on.
But not all of John Studd's patients share his enthusiasm for castration. When Jackie Bartley met him at his London clinic, she agreed to a hysterectomy, but stressed she wanted to keep her ovaries. John Studd reassured her he wouldn't remove them. Mrs. Bartley assumed the operation had gone according to plan, but when she arrived home from the hospital, she discovered the truth.
The bill wasn't ready when we left the hospital on the 6th day, so the Lister Hospital sent us on the bill to check. We checked through and quite shockingly looked and saw hormone replacement therapy procedure and implants and thought, I've got somebody else's bill here. And you know, sort of first of all, not in the slightest bit occur to me that this could possibly be me. Phoned up my GP. She said, no, you've obviously got somebody else's bill, you need to sort it out with John Studd. And later on, she phoned me back, my GP, and said, could you pop down to the surgery to see me? And she'd received a letter from John Studd in the post saying that he found endometriosis while operating and that he'd removed my ovaries and fallopian tubes.
It's a very, very serious decision for a woman to have her ovaries out. It's like a man having his balls cut off. I mean, it's no joke. You get a premature menopause, and there are all sorts of implications associated with that, which women have got to be aware of. Now, if a woman says to a surgeon, I expressly do not want you to remove my ovaries, or I've only got one ovary left, I do not want you to remove that ovary, then it seems to me if a surgeon then removes it without discussion, is tantamount to a criminal act. I mean, it's like me walking up to a random woman in the street and taking her breasts off, or ovaries off, or somebody walking up to a random man in the street and taking their balls off without any discussion. I mean, it's ridiculous.
John Studd had removed Mrs. Bartley's ovaries without her consent. She was so incensed she took him to court, risking everything on a legal action which nobody thought she could win. The case went on for 3 years, but its outcome was a triumph for Mrs. Bartley and women like her.
At the very, very end of the summing up, the master decided that John Studd was guilty of assault, battery and negligence and illegal removal of the ovaries. And I was just so... I mean, my husband summed it up for me because he just went, yeah, in the courtroom, because it was like 3 years of stress completely lifted. We had done it, we'd won.
The law is quite simple, that no matter what the medical sense of my operation on Mrs. Bartley, the law says that it was wrong, and I have no defense for that. I have no defense at all. I removed her ovaries unknowingly, without consent, and it was a mistake.
But his mistake will affect her for the rest of her life. She now has no alternative but to take HRT.
The future is basically every 6 months I have to have an implant of HRT. So I have to go along, have my side cut, have an implant put in every 6 months, which I basically don't, look forward to, as you can imagine. The discomfort is tremendous. I end up with very bad bruising. He made that decision. Another decision he made for me was for the next 20 years, you've got to have this.
Women ought to be offered the choice about having their ovaries removed, and this discussion ought to take place then, so that they know that the consequences of agreeing to have their ovaries out means that they ought to be taking HRT in the long term. If they don't want to do that, then they should hang on to their ovaries.
One reason why women find it so hard to hang on to their ovaries is the virtually incomprehensible consent form they're asked to sign when they go into hospital. Susan McShane is one of the many victims of this medical gobbledygook.
The way it was written meant nothing to me. It was in medical terms, and it actually stated a TAH, question mark, BSO. When I asked the registrar before I signed the paper what it meant, she actually explained and said that the question mark was there because obviously no decision had been made until I spoke to the consultant. So therefore I signed the consent form.
Susan never realised what she'd signed away until it was too late, but she's determined that other women won't have to go through the same thing.
We've got proposals for you today.
Working with law students from Plymouth University, she's campaigning for a radically different consent form which would prevent women from having operations they don't want.
Firstly, the patient should be given a carbon copy of their consent form at the time of signature. Secondly, that details of the risks, if there are any, that are inherent in the surgery to follow, must be listed on the consent form.
Yeah, and with that you have to make sure that the risks they are the substantial risks.
Yeah.
Not because
Susan discovered the hard way that hospital consent forms give surgeons enormous powers of discretion, sometimes at the expense of patients.
The patient thinks they're protected by it, but it isn't worth the paper it's written on. So at the end of the day, the patient has no protection, no power. That is all the consultants.
But while the consultant has the upper hand, there are some women who always seem to lose out in the medical lottery.
We know from all evidence that women in lower social classes have a much worse deal from the NHS. And it is true that if a woman has a very low educational achievement, she has a much higher chance of having a hysterectomy.
Middle class women are much less likely to have hysterectomy than working class women. We don't know why this is, but it may be because middle class women find it easier to get information about the alternatives to hysterectomy than working class women.
Now this divide has been dramatically confirmed in a new study in the British Medical Journal. It reveals that women who leave school with few qualifications are 14 times more likely to have a hysterectomy than those with a degree.
There we are, there's the uterus. You see the cervix there. Taken out virtually no vagina. You see how long the cervix is. Uterus is sitting there, right? Tubes, tiny little ovaries. I would say a fairly bulky uterus actually. For a study this age. Ovaries are not very big, look fairly innocuous. And there's the phallic rings that we talked about there. The rings that we used to sterilise. Right. So this will go away to the laboratory to be double checked.
Some women choose hysterectomy after weighing up all the options. But the medical profession isn't giving enough women that choice.
I always thought they were very clever people. And then I worked it out one day. If they cannot cure problem periods, they certainly cannot go on to amputate a woman's reproductive organs and then try to control the whole of her body with induced hormones. They are actually taking on something that I would say is almost impossible. And yet, they're so totally misguided that they think they can do it.
Catherine, hello there, your operation's all finished. Everything's fine, okay? Can you hear me okay? Open your eyes now.
Until women are properly consulted, the cost to them and the health service will be enormous.
The most important thing in this debate is the involvement of women in the debate. That may seem an obvious thing to say, but I suspect has not really happened as much as it should have had over the past 30, 40 years. The fact that there are such wide variations in hysterectomy rates between countries and between regions means that a new consensus needs to be derived between women and gynecologists to work out what is the best procedure for this problem.
Today there is no consensus. One doctor advises caution, another reaches for the scalpel. While hysterectomy remains this kind of lottery, women will most often be the losers.
I think you should be given one option at a time, and you should take that option away, think about it, look at videos, read up on it, understand the effects, the fors, the againsts, and really think about that, and then try that if that's what you wish. Because a hysterectomy is not like having your tonsils out, or your inguinal toenail off, or You know, it's like, it matters to your life. It affects your life.
To order a set of free fact sheets on hysterectomy and health-related issues, call the Channel 4 order line on